everyone.
Happy to have you. We are here today to discuss group policies.
We sure are. We're totally prepared too. All right, let's get on with this.
Oh, I just tried to click the next slide in your deck.
That's not going to work.
No, that is definitely not.
All right, guys. I'm assuming you can see my screen, so let's just kick this off. Group policies that kill chains. Jordan, what's a kill chain?
The kill chain or the cyber kill chain?
You can't say that one.
A kill chain is about an 8-step process defined by various organizations across the internet that defines the process an attacker goes through to gain access to your network, escalate privilege in your network, move laterally through your network, and then exfil.
And we're going to kill those.
Hopefully.
Using group policies.
God talk. A long time. That's great. Thank you. So yeah, anyway, we are also introducing a company we are working on to produce training materials that will be presented with and alongside Black Hills Information Security called Defensive Origins.
And we will be at this one, Wild West Hack and Fest, way west. Jason?
Absolutely. That is what we're working on now. Way West is in San Diego. It's in March. So if anyone wants to join us in San Diego in March or Way West, Wild West Hack and Fest, we'd love to have you. Tickets are available.
Beautiful 73-degree weather in March. All right, so a small warning here. This slide deck is really dense. There's a lot of information here. We're going to release a blog. We're going to release the slide deck. We'll release the information inside of the slide deck in a useful way that you can tangibly use and configure group policies, that type of stuff. We're also recording the presentation. So if you look through this and you're like, oh, I can't read this tiny text. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry. I hate slide decks that have small text.
And group policies especially, right? They're also very dense, right? You got an escalating tree of things you can click on and then thousands of options. So yes, capturing that in text is, in readable text is challenging.
Absolutely. All right. So the kill chain. All right. So someone a while ago made reference to, we talk about getting domain admin, and that's not the end all of the pen test or of an attacker, right? The end goal is to like sit there, find data, take your time and exfil and everything else. But there is this idea that getting in a pen test, getting you to domain admin very, very fast is like an awesome win. And it's not really.
Are those my kids?
Those are not your kids.
Looks like my kids, but fair. Thank you.
It's awkward.
I mean,
yeah. Anyways, okay. So
sorry.
Yeah, you're gonna throw me off. All right. So we get DA sometimes in 2 hours, sometimes in minutes, and when we do that, it's typically because of something that can be really easily prevented with group policy or with just structuring your organization differently. And what we're going to talk about today are some ways that you can take the knowledge we've gained about how you gain DA in 2 hours or a few minutes and kind of look at that from the perspective of how could we prevent this and what are the implications in doing that. And again, you could look at this and say, well, it's just low-hanging fruit. But I would say if it's low-hanging fruit, why is there so much of it everywhere? It shouldn't be like that if it's just low-hanging fruit. This is not stuff that a typical script kiddie could do, but they could if they did their research. And it's just one of those things that you look at and you're like, you should be doing these things already, but pen test after pen test proves that no one is, or very few are. And the ones that
especially combining all of them.
Yeah, definitely.
That is exceedingly rare, right? Some people do a lot of these things very well, limiting these via group policies and restrictions on your network, but really no environment has all of these things totally nailed down.
And I think it's worth noting here that we're not talking about a product that you need to purchase to do this. This is something you already have in your domain environment that you just need to tweak and configure. So, all right. So before we get started with the actual group policies, we have to talk about your current environment. Now, if you have inherited a 25-year-old Active Directory domain environment that's had 300 different sysadmins in it, I'm sorry, but you really need to look at what you've got so far to move forward and start looking at these other things first. Now, that said, you could have that inherited environment and be very clean. If you're not, we're very quickly going to talk about what that should look like. And you want to have this kind of in place before you move forward, because if you do a lot of these other group policies, they're all hinging on you have an efficient domain control environment that is easy to manage and easy to support. If you don't have that, these group policies can really be a headache later on when you try to troubleshoot them.
And let me just take a step back here.
Yeah.
John hates when we talk about background, but for the last 15 years, anytime I've had a question about Active Directory, DNS, group policy application, troubleshooting something that's broken, I have asked this gentleman right here, and he has helped me work through all of those problems for that time period. So this is someone who I lean on heavily for AD, DNS, GPO, and he will be speaking mostly through this slide deck. So
He says that.
continue on.
He just made me feel really old though. Okay, so we're gonna fly through this. Okay, no, the slides you care about are about 3 slides in the future. So hang out. If you have a domain that you're like, hey, I inherited this. What are they talking about? These best practices. Just listen up really quick, and then each one of these you can Google, or each one of these could be its own webcast, and we're not going to talk about them right now. Principle of least privilege, right? Don't give your users more access than they need. You need to have network segmentation. You need to understand the OSI model in a way that you know where your applications are operating. If you have custom applications, you need to know what they're doing. If you have commercial applications that you're using, you need to know how they're operating in the OSI model so that you can properly secure them. When it comes down to centralized logging, we're going to talk about logging today, especially with event logs and that type of stuff. And if you don't have those going into a singular place that you have a single pane of glass to find logs, you have a very difficult time to be able to actually look at things from the perspective of, was there a compromise? And if there was a compromise, how do you start researching that? If you have centralized logging, you can do that. Internet filtering, you should just have this, right? That goes along with the workstation internet proxy. We talk about honeypots. We're not talking about today though, but we have in the past. And the key thing there is you should have these. If you don't, consider getting them. AV and anti-malware, those are the things that you have to have. We're not suggesting that these group policies are going to fix the stuff that should already be done in your environment. You should already be using Microsoft's baseline analyzer. If you use that, it's going to suggest group policies that we're going to talk about today. Passwords. That is a whole webcast in itself. In fact, I think we've got one coming up with Darren
and
that.
CJ, unless that already happened.
And
Was that last week?
I'm not going to answer that. VPNs and MFA, and then password age complexity, again, back to passwords. Okay, this slide is messy, and I'm so sorry for it. You need to have a well-defined Active Directory environment before you start making a lot of changes here. So one thing that came back a long time ago was we did a pen test, and there's like 3,000 groups, and there was like 2,500 employees. And the first thing I said is, that's really cool.
Yeah, that is
Like,
exactly
that's
how
awesome.
this should be deployed, managed, and implemented. I guarantee they have job functional groups.
Yeah, somewhere along the line, they probably hit middle management that said, hold up, why do we have more groups than we do users? Why do we have groups with one user in them? And there's a reason. Those reasons typically are directly related to job functional security groups. And what we're talking about there is you can take a security group in Active Directory, you can mail enable it so it becomes a distribution group. You can put groups inside of groups inside of groups inside of groups. You can have resources that are managed the day someone hires because you gave them a security group that matched their job role.
And immediately flowed into all of their file shares, appropriate permissions groups across, anything they need. This is the best practice.
And nothing they don't. Now that comes down to managing job function security, and all of your support staff now need to understand what someone in the organization does. But the key thing there is it's managed, and it's managed once. That goes into a big efficiency thing, but it's needed here because these group policies really hinge on all of this, all these group best practices. Now, we talk about the jugular and AGUDLP. I really struggle with that one. Microsoft says to use AGUDLP. I can't because it's not as fun to say as jugular. So jugular uses silent J, user group, universal, domain, local, and resource. What that means is that you're never putting a user account inside of a local permission. You're always putting a group attached to a local permission, a group in that group, and a group in that group, and finally a user in that final group. If that doesn't make sense, there's a big tree. We'll have a webcast on it someday. The point is, you should be able to look at something and say, will you email all of the East region senior social media analysts? And the answer is yes, I can do that right now. Let the South Atlanta office know that the fire alarm is going off at 10 a.m. for a test, right? You should be able to do those things in your environment very, very quickly. You should be able to send out all marketing departments. This is our new corp marketing director, and that email went to all the marketing departments across all of the campuses. And of course, you can email all staff, and that doesn't mean you have to select 1,600 users individually. You select one group called all staff that has a group and 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 a user.
I would like to talk about your background in this, and I know a lot of it has to do with compliance, Was this specific to being part of the IT administration team for a publicly traded company
Yes.
and learning how this actually functions?
Yeah, so if you look at this right now, someone that hasn't seen this before is thinking, whoa, how am I supposed to manage
Thank
this? And the answer to that is you write a script that does recursive group membership. So you can say, look at this ACL and tell me all the people that have access to it and why they have access to it. Right? You write a script that does that. You also write a script that says, give me this user and recursively look through all their groups and tell me what access they have. The idea being is that every ACL you have has a group in it or multiple groups. And because of that, you're able to manage that all with an Active Directory group membership. Hey, CJ.
How you doing, sir? You slowing us down? You ready? What do you got?
I'm not to slow you down. Yeah, it's not an interesting observation. Jason says, unfortunately, not everything functions properly with nested groups. You guys have any observations around that?
Yes, we do. So there's a couple things. If you talk about Microsoft, they, again, tell you to use the AGU DLP. Which if you're not using a very large forest can be AGDLP because you're not using universal groups unless you use Exchange, which requires universal groups because it's inside of the global address list. Now, all of that said, there are other things like LDAP integration. LDAP integration, depending on the version you use, will not use recursive lookups. It might only look at the group membership of one group and not actually look and see if that the user way over here nested down 10 times is a member of that group. So you might have to actually look at that. Now, how you handle that is, unfortunately, that user, you might have to have a group that has a bunch of users in it. I don't like that. I would try to avoid that as best as you can. You might be able to use create a middle tier script that could do that, but typically, most systems that integrate with LDAP now are going to be able to do recursive lookups. The ones that don't are the ones that look and they'll say LDAP integrated, right? And what they're doing is they're going to pull the group membership of just one group, the members of just one group, and they're going to say, hey, that user's not in that group, right? It's not there. So that's the idea there. And again, different types of integration with it. And all right, moving forward, organizational units. Man, we're still talking about this. All right, LSDOU, we're trying to get to this really fast. LSDOU, that is the way that the group policies will be assigned, right? So local site domain organizational unit. So you're going to assign at the very top, which is the local, the computer, can be replaced by the site, can be replaced by the domain, can be replaced by the organizational unit. It flows in that direction. You should have the baseline domain-wide GPO should not have very much in it. Remember the default group policy that's on the domain at the very top? I personally would delete it and put it somewhere else and recreate the things that are inside there. And there's this idea that no, never touch the default group policy. And first off, it's got a terrible name. What does it do? I don't know. It's the default one. We don't want to mess with it. Yeah, I would just recreate the contents of it and give it a name that is appropriate.
Yeah, so a GPO is a tattoo, right? You have to unconfigure in GPO and re-tattoo the unconfiguration over top of a deployed tattooed configuration to remove settings. So be very careful when you apply things. We will mention this again. But RSOP, somebody asked about RSOP. This is the resultant set of policy. Very standard command I run, gpresult-h report.html. Then I can open everything associated with the computer I'm authenticated to and the user a customer provided me, right? This gives me a very broad perspective of what has been applied to my system and my user account. I have called a customer out for putting me in a container that was so restricted I couldn't properly test, right? They moved me into a standard user container. These are things that you should be considering as you, nope, we hit Max.
All right.
Incredible.
So we just got to pop up.
Welcome, everyone. Seriously, welcome. Thank you for spending time with us. We will be releasing the slide deck, the video. We will be producing follow-up videos for each of these group policies, basically associating an attack, the group policy ramifications, and how it resolves the attack we implement in a short video segment on YouTube as soon as we can.
All right, so really quick to finish this slide up, there's things on group policies you should try to avoid if you can.
Whoa. Hang on. Is this true?
Yes, so to talk about group policy tattoo that Jordan mentioned, preferences you are tattooed. Policies can be removed upon removal of the group policy. But there are some group policies that when you apply, they actually do apply, and when you remove the GPO, because that is the last setting, aren't removed. It just depends on the default. But Things to avoid on group policies: avoid policy inheritance if you can. Avoid policy enforcement if you can. The reason for that is if you structure your organizational unit nicely in a very thought out manner, you really don't need to use those. The reason you don't want to use those is because, sorry, the webinar keeps popping up saying,
There's
hey,
a box
too
that
many
says,
users.
do not show this again.
So the reason you don't want to do those things is it creates a problem for support. If support has to go through and try to troubleshoot group policies, if they have to deal with policy inheritance and policy enforcement and loopbacks, it becomes much more difficult than a straightforward group policy management application that you definitely can utilize if you have a great organizational structure pre-configured. Moving on. Okay, so this is where it's going to get real. So we started talking about the group policies that can stop all of these attacks. And we said, we'll do the top 5. And then we were like, nah,
10?
more than
Is it
5.
10? What's a good number? 13?
16.
Nah.
So then we quickly realized that this was going to have to be more than one webcast because there's a lot of them. The items here highlighted in red are the ones we're going to talk about in some capacity today. Future webcasts will eventually, hopefully, maybe cover all of them. Again, why can't I hold all these lines? There's a lot of stuff here. We can't cover it in one day. At the same time, though, there's an awesome video on Twitter of Egypt juggling, and I just found it amusing because you might as well be juggling limes. We're not going to talk about all that stuff that's in that list of group policies we're going to cover today because we're going to cover them right now. But first, we're going to talk about best practices. Here's the thing about best practices for network defensory. Google has a really great way of defining what best practices are, and it does it by giving you 1.2 billion results because that's how Google works. And apparently there's 1.2 billion best practices in the world, and trying to find the ones that are meaningful, well, we'll have a blog about that. I think it's difficult. Just we're talking about it. No one can define what a best practice is absolute, right? Because it's going to be dependent on what your environment looks like. And you're going to have to tailor it to your business. That said, these are what we consider best practices for network defensory. But again, we're not really sure if that means anything at all according to Google. So moving on. Slide number 12. We are not going to talk about these group policies, but since we're on the topic, we'd like you to look at these group policies. And if you aren't doing these right now, you should go to slide 12. This is essentially the best group policy in the world. So things like passwords, which is going to be a topic for an upcoming webcast. You should have, and now in Windows 2016, you can do passwords with a minimum length of more than 15 characters.
By default.
Well, no, it's not by default, but you can without changing.
No, I don't mean default, but without extending the schema like you had to do in previous.
Without doing anything.
Whoa.
We're on DC 2016. We can make this, 254 minimum if you really hate your users or hate your support staff, I guess. So the key thing there is 15 characters. Why does that even matter? 14 characters, circa 2008, I think was the last time, DC 2008. You would have been storing passwords with the landman hash. Now, why that's bad is landman hash will take your 14 character password, split it in 2, make 2 7-character strings, capitalize all of them, and then store them in 2 different strings that you can then crack independently. It takes, last time we checked, about 34 seconds to crack the entirety of the landman hash space using our cracker at BHIS. So if you have 14 character passwords and you're storing landman hashes, that's bad. We're going to destroy those in about 14 seconds. If you use a minimum password length of 15 characters, here's the thing. Landman only stores 14 character passwords or less. So if you have a 15 character password, Windows legitimately says, I can't actually store that in a landman hash, so it just doesn't, right? You'll still have the old password there, the old landman hash there if you're in a legacy environment, but not the new one will be stored. So that is there as well. Make sure you meet password complexity requirements. Please allow your users to use dictionary words inside of your passwords, unless you can convince us otherwise. Talking about lockout operations. You want to make sure that your computers will not allow someone to brute force in insanely fast methods. The actual numbers here are fairly arbitrary because you're not preventing someone from trying to log in and get the password wrong 5 times before they get it correct, right? A user legitimately could make that, and you're going to force them to call the help desk. That said, what you do want to prevent is someone doing 1 million password attempts in 15 minutes. And that's what we're trying to prevent here. So also it's really great for logging because you can see which users are having trouble. You can also see which user accounts might be compromised in the fashion that someone knows them and are trying to guess those passwords. All right, so interactive login stuff, the lower left-hand corner. It's more useful for users than it is really anything else, but there's things like display user information when the session is locked. You don't need to. if the computer is at someone's desk and it's their desk, why do you need to remind them what their name is? You don't. Just same with don't display last login. It's not necessary. Now that means that your users will actually have to type the username in before they log in. Okay, I assume that their username is easy to type. It should be. It's typically related to their name or an ID that they're using all the time anyway. Other things that are in there, you know, the machine and activity limit, you can set it so if someone walks away from their computer for 10 minutes, it's going to lock. That's good. You don't want their computer to sit out there forever. You can do this in other places as well, especially with password policies. You can set like screensavers and then set a screensaver to launch in 10 minutes. And then after the screensaver launches, you actually require a password to unlock. This is doing the same thing, but instead of being in the password policy, or excuse me, in the power policies, it's an interactive login. All right, moving on. So let's get into the beef here. Jordan, I'm letting you take this one.
Are you? I wasn't quite ready. I was still
then
typing.
You're not taking it. All right.
Oh, yeah. So dealing with local admins. This is important, right? Creating honey accounts is interesting. If you change the name of your local administrator account, turn that into an actual administrator, remove administrator privileges from administrator, and then monitor those account usages closely, you will know.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting here. By the way, for the rest of the slide deck, the actual location of the policies and preferences are going to be right underneath the header. So right underneath the header and the small text on the right-hand side, you'll see where these locations are for these policies. To get to the Jordan's point, though, you can actually take the administrator account, you can disable it, and you can change the name so it's basically non-functional, right? And then you can actually create a new user account called administrator that you're just watching. It doesn't even have to be privileged for anything. You're just watching it to see what's happening to it, because in a secure environment, nothing should be happening to it. And if something does happen, that's a problem. And on the respective honey accounts, you can actually create honey accounts in your environment that don't give them access to anything, or give them access to only honeypots, and give them an easy password, right? What is it, Winter 2019 Bang would be a great option, because then as soon as someone logs into that account, you know that there's someone actively attacking your network. And if you have multiple stuff set up in terms of logs and that type of thing, you can actually look at what their attack method is and actually define out what that kill chain looked like for them, so you can prevent it in the future. And also drop their access from the network right away.
You changed my local administrator from ADM Zaphod to Wally Smith.
I did change it to Wally
Man.
Smith. It doesn't have to be Wally Smith, but if it's
right.
ADM,
I get it.
it's indicative of an admin account.
42.
Jordan, you want to talk about laps?
Yeah, we were just, I was answering a question here saying this was an upcoming slide. Yeah, we like laps despite its challenges. Marcello has a fantastic story here where we compromised a laps admin on a network. We're able to retrieve 400 plus servers, local administrator accounts. So he goes ahead and does his magic with code, executes a PowerShell script to touch all of those, create a whole bunch of mini dumps, extract those, run Mimikatz, and then parse them. So it was, you know, laps is scary. Without some form of encryption specific to the user who is administering laps is dangerous, but it is better than nothing. So storing a password in this key, so AD Explorer, right, under ADM PWD is clear text. This is bad. But anyway, so.
But slightly better if you use
It's slightly better than, yes, because you can restrict access to it. Otherwise, any user on your domain with an extended schema for this particular flag or attribute can retrieve that value.
So the alternative, though, is not managing local administrators at all, really.
Someone else here mentioned PAS and PAM, right? PAS, PAM, you familiar with those two?
Not in the context of this.
No, I'm not either. So
We'll check it out.
yeah, no doubt.
All right, so dealing with local admins in the terms of who are the local admins on a workstation. This can create contention in your environment if you have a senior official that wants to be able to install their special software without asking anybody, but you should have already had those conversations, and there should be an expectation of what that actually looks like. There's two different ways to do this, one via policies and one via preferences. Again, the locations of those are in the upper right-hand corner. There's a key difference in the two. If you use preferences, it gives you a little bit more option to configure things in a certain way. Most specifically, you can delete all members out of a group and delete all member groups out of the group. This is important. So the idea here is that if you were to go and say add a user into local admin for a specific workstation, and forget about it, that's a problem. You can use group policies to every time the computer starts, it's going to wipe out that administrators group and recreate it with very specific users with exactly what you're looking for. And that way you don't have to worry about it. It also means that your support staff can go in and add a local admin temporarily. And that temporary admin can install software if they need to. But then as soon as that computer reboots, it's back to the original settings that were configured by the support desk and the group policies. So these are things you should have set up. This is a great place where Bloodhound comes in. If you have local admins, we can run Bloodhound and we can basically inject one user account. And Bloodhound will go through and say, hey, this user has a local admin to this workstation over here. And that workstation over there had 4 sessions operating. One of those sessions was a user that also had local admin over here. And on that workstation over here, they also have a session where there is a domain admin logged in. And that domain admin, of course, is a web. So the kind of idea there is that you want to restrict local admins because it gives you access to Mimikatz or can give you access to plain text passwords or passwords in memory. CJ.
Since you brought up Bloodhound, one of the users earlier was talking about, will any of the group policies help in limiting the facility of Bloodhound?
Yeah, I'd like to say I consider Bloodhound a blue team tool as much as a red team tool. Personally, right? It helps me define Active Directory control paths from my current user credential set to DA, to EA, to whatever you're targeting, right? And it allows enumeration of all kinds of things in an Active Directory environment. These are all available through whatever schema privileges exist. Any user on a domain can ask for all kinds of information about that domain. And Bloodhound is not necessarily a red team tool, but used by red teamers to find the fastest path to DA. So we are going to show you how to catch it. You want to catch execution? Yes. You want to get the right event logs? Yes. Check, check, check. We will show you that. It's not necessarily a devious tool in my opinion.
And we can do some research on how to actually prevent Bloodhound. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the upcoming slides. So looking at addressing LLMNR, NBNS, and WPAD. So we're not going to go into great detail about what these are, but essentially, if you have an attacker on your network layer 2, they can reach out to all the other workstations on your environment and say, you need to talk to me for everything. And when you do that, be sure to submit your hashes, password hashes, of course. So the idea here is that you don't want that to happen. This is going to be MDNS, LLMNR, MBNS. These are the ways that you can configure that. Now, we don't need to go into a great detail here. This is how you disable that from happening in Windows. This is default behavior of Windows is to do this. So you want to prevent that from happening. There's the location for it in group policy. And then very specifically, there's some of these portions regarding LLMNR that you can't do in group policy, at least not traditionally without some PowerShell help. So this is actually going through, and if you look at what the script does, it's basically going through and going to look at the interfaces that are attached to a workstation, and it's going to set the NetBIOS option to be disabled, I believe. Yep, right here.
Yes.
So
and it enumerates adapters too,
this is
right?
not easy to do in in group policies, because in group policies you'd actually have to like select the network interface adapter to configure these, but there's a good chance that the network interface adapter on your workstation is going to be different from a different workstation. Very, very difficult to do. You're much better off creating a script that runs this group policy either at boot or once upon its provisioning. All right, moving on. SMB signing, message signing. We had a discussion before the show. Someone asked about this, and we'll kind of address that as well. But SMB signing, this is a really big one for us. We get this all the time. Default is disabled. So what SMB signing is we can, if we're using like LLMNR or Responder, one of those other tools that essentially says, yes, we are every service you're looking for, right? That's the attacker saying, yeah, whatever you want, I'll handle that. You can actually use SMB relay, and you can say, yes, I'm that guy, whatever you're looking for, I'll do it for you. And that client is going to connect to us, right? And if we use SMB relay, we can actually take those requests and we can forward them to where they actually intend to go, but we're going to do it for them. And when we do that, we're essentially doing man in the middle, but we're capturing everything in that process. This is the way to prevent that. So with SMB relay attacks, we don't have the certificate that the Active Directory domain would, right? Because we're a man in the middle. We're not privileged the same way the domain controller is. So in the environment where this is default, clients aren't going to care. They're going to look at man in the middle and be like, oh yeah, whatever. They're who I'm looking for. Even though they don't have the certificate, that's okay, because we're going to trust them because that's the default. This says hold up, man in the middle, attacker, I will trust you, but first, will you give me the certificate that says you're trusted on the domain? And of course, man in the middle, we don't have that certificate. So we're gonna look at it like, no, we're not doing that. And that communication with the client stops right there. Whereas we no longer can use SMB relaying to spawn shells, to grab hashes, anything like that if this is enabled. This is a big one. Again, location in the upper right-hand corner. So the question that came up pre-show banter was, if you are an organization that wants to deploy this, there was a discussion that said, if we enable this everywhere, it's going to slow down the performance of our network. And we kind of talked about that before the show. I mean, yes, you're right. It absolutely will, but not much, right? So in the environment, if we had everything just like it is today, Windows 2016, running on equipment that was built in 2005, right? Things are going to run dead slow. And the impact of something like this is going to be really big. The impact of doing something like this today on modern equipment is not going to be noticeable. It's going to be milliseconds on that transaction. And I think the key thing there is that, yeah, it was an issue later on. And if you've got, say, for example, a CISO that came up through the ranks, maybe started in the IT department, maybe started in support 20 years ago, they're going to be like, hey, we looked at this 20 years ago. You can't just do that. Yeah, you can. Stuff is different than it was 20 years ago. And I think that's a key thing to point out. A lot of these group policies are going to behave that same way, where there is an actual CPU cycle that's related to it, or a user impact that's related to it. And we're kind of ignoring that entirely in this webcast, because those numbers are relatively small unless you're using really old equipment. And then in that case, you've got other issues that you need to work out, right? So that's the idea on SMB message signing, excuse me. Make sure you got that certificate and that your clients don't trust just anyone as a man in the middle.
I would also like to point out one more time that our audience is way smarter than I am. And that's scary. Yeah, so fair enough. Anyway, we are here just to describe our perspective. I just want to reiterate this from red team, blue team, purple team, defense, alert, multi-domain management, MSSP background. Holy cow, there's so much knowledge in this webinar right now. I just want to point that out. This is amazing. Thank you all for sharing like the LDAP strings and queries, and this stuff is awesome. So thank you.
Hey, Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
None of us is as smart as all of us.
That's so true. Hive mind. I saw that blaze by.
You definitely
Go ahead, keep rolling, man.
If you look at us and you say they're wrong, great, just let us know.
Yeah, thank you.
And
Seriously.
we'll address it on the next webcast. And that's just the thing, is everyone's environment is also different. And this, as much as BHIS does this, it's also community impact, right? We all have to work together. And if we're not all working together, we're all working against each other, and that's no fun.
Yes.
Click the button.
Button coming.
This one is awesome. Configuring host-based firewalls. There wasn't a time in my life that host-based firewalls were like the bane of existence. Support hated it because they couldn't do everything they needed to do.
Right. Cultural. It was like a cultural aversion to turning on a workstation firewall. Still exists, but
because support becomes that much more difficult.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the deal. You really need to do this. There is no reason that a workstation here talking to this server and this workstation here talking to this server need to talk to each other, right? There's just no reason for it. And even in the domain environment, unless a workstation is trying to serve something, which they shouldn't need to, you're actually opening up a lot of problems. So the idea is that, yeah, your workstation firewall should be on, and it should be allowed for certain ports that are necessary for the domain environment to work. But even that, you can IP source filter those only to maybe the admin department, so only they can do it. And I guess there's an argument there that if an admin workstation gets popped, well, I mean, that's going to be bad anyway. So the point here is that a workstation gets compromised on your network, that workstation should not be able to talk and have access to all the other workstations in the environment. It should have access to only the things that it needs to have access to do its job. And maybe the internet, because everybody needs to check Facebook, right, at work. Maybe not. But the point there is that, yeah, it should be secured. And there are arguments on whether or not there's arguments about it being difficult to configure. And yeah, it's not the easiest thing to configure in the world. But from a workstation perspective, turn all the firewalls on and see what happens. There's a good chance you're not actually going to break anything on the workstation side. Now, if you turn all the firewalls on the servers and you try to leave it that way, you might have a bad day. But moving on. So from the perspective of limiting and restricting network logons, there's a great thing here is that by default, Windows is gonna be like, oh yeah, you're a user, cool. Yeah, what do you need?
You want to log on to a DA as a ADFS service? Sure. Why not?
Sure, why not?
RDP, yeah, no problem.
So
SMB, yeah, it's fine.
Windows has this really great thing that it can distinctively say whether or not someone is coming and logging in across the network or logging in as a physical user sitting at the desktop, right? And that distinction is very important when it comes down to things like service accounts and also attacker that's not sitting at the computer. Should a service account using ADFS or this ADFS service account be able to log in to the workstation sitting there? Probably not. Should a user be able to log into another workstation somewhere else for SMB services? Probably not, unless there's a reason for it. And you should be able to abstract what those reasons are and look at it from that perspective of this user should be able to do this thing, they need to be able to do this thing, so we gave them access. Not the other way around where this user should be able to do this, so they always have access no matter what. And the people that don't need access, they have access too because. So that's the idea here. Have your, excuse me.
Divide by 0.
Take your user
Always.
accounts, figure out which accounts should be able to log in remotely, figure out which accounts should be able to log in on desktops or in person or VMware console, right? And be able to define what those are and then configure them with group policies so that a user account, that a service account should not be logging into a desktop if it doesn't need to log into a desktop. All right, WPAD. So this is interesting. The lower side of the screenshot, right, is about the proxy. That's configuring a proxy in your environment to make sure that all of your web traffic goes through like Blue Coat or a Cascade device, a web filtering device, something like that. That's great. But the key one here is the one above that, which says automatically detect settings. That's WPAD. So you can have a device on the network, an attacker can have a device on the network that says, yeah, whatever you want for the internet, come to me first, right? And I'll just proxy that for you because I'm the authenticated proxy device for this network. If you set this by default, where your computer systems will not ask anyone for what that default proxy should be, then it won't look for it and it's not going to use it. Even if you've got an attacker out there saying, yeah, I'm that proxy you want, your workstation's never going to ask for it, so it's not going to use it. And that's a key one there because this is not disabled by default. This is checked by default, which means as soon as the attacker shows up and says, hey, I'm your WPAD, go ahead and send me all of your web traffic, your workstation's gonna be like, oh, hey, he's my proxy. I'm gonna use him because he says he has internet access. And that's how it's gonna work. These are simple things that need to be configured in your environment so that this does not happen. This slows an attacker down. It's not gonna stop the attacker, but it's gonna slow them down to the point that the first thing they tried didn't work. They're gonna have to try something else. And every time you force them to do something else, they're gonna get sloppier and sloppier until they get caught. Moving on. Jordan, this is a great one.
Yeah, I caught up with Kent and took over the slide deck about 12:30 at this point, and then I Bing searched.
This slide looks really familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does.
All right. Best
Bing
practices.
only managed to find 362 million results for best practice. Same with Yahoo, and Kent informs me that Bing and Yahoo use the same search engine as DuckDuckGo on the back end.
DuckDuckGo, which is all Bing.
Is that accurate? They all use Bing.
They're using Bing. Yahoo and DuckDuckGo use Bing.
Was news to me.
Yeah. So I don't know what to think of it, the fact that Bing only found 362 million results and Google found 1.2 billion. I think there's something to be said about that, but I'm not sure what to say about it. Do you want more or less best practices?
Yeah, right.
I think maybe Bing's is more meaningful because they found less results. I don't know.
How many pages of results would that be? Could you like actually click to the end of that?
It's too many.
Is there a way to jump to the end of Google search results? Does anyone know that dork?
And how useful is that last result? Do you feel really bad about the support guy that had to get to the last page of 362 million records?
I just want to know. That's all. I don't know why that occurred to me.
All right, the best practices for alerting. Okay, Jordan, this slide is great. I'm gonna let you talk about it.
Which one are? Oh, here
yeah.
we are.
Pay attention. What are you doing?
This is a GPO.
Sleeping over there? It's not.
What are we
group policy.
talking about? Wait.
We're supposed to be talking about group policies. This is not about a group policy.
This is true. But we are talking about logging, and logging matters, right? So now we have kind of moved out of some of our favorite network configuration practices. We can't call them best practices. Are they best practices?
Well, they're
network practices that limit our ability to pivot around your network and do things that we like to do on pen tests. So now we are moving into the section about Windows auditing and logging. This is something you should do as well. These are 3 quick commands you can run on systems. You could probably script this. You could do whatever you want, but This is a lot of logs. This is going to generate a lot of noise. This is going to generate more than a lot of noise, probably way more than you care to parse.
20 years ago, this was a problem, right?
This
If
was a
you did
huge
this,
problem.
your systems would slow to a crawl, to an absolute crawl. Now your workstation's gonna be like, oh yeah, whatever. Yeah.
So are we going to catch things in here, like useful things? Are we going to see somebody running Kerberos?
Oh, yeah, no.
No.
You'll be able to check trails, but the stuff you're looking for, what you just talked about, what an attacker would do is not going to be in there. Or, some of the reasons.
It's not enough, is it?
It's just not. Now, again, 20 years ago, someone would say like, hey, that guy making too many logs. You're slowing the systems down. And nobody cared. Nobody cares now because, your workstation, if you have a system log and it's just logging, as long as you've got the log cap size set up and centralized logging, you'll be okay. CJ!
Yeah, let's take a moment here. We ought to catch up here. So
I'm not sure I agree with that. I saw something, you can crush your Windows server, certain log settings on processes and things
Depends
like
on your ingestion tool, right? If you're using Windows Event Forwarding and you're using a centralized Windows box for this, you will destroy the thing. It doesn't matter how much RAM you give it or how much disk, you will tip it over. It will happen.
I might have to do some deeper research on what they were telling us.
What if we go to S3 and use Elasticache? That's not very good either, right? That's not that good of an engine for. Sorry, I'm sorry.
CJ's
what are you getting at?
CJ's perspective is if you push everything off to Elasticache, you could fill a very large pipe very quickly with data getting ingested into Amazon.
No, I've been told that on a specific Windows server, you turn certain logging on, you can crush the performance of that system.
We didn't say turn all logging on.
Yeah, this isn't even all logging.
That's fine, I'm out.
Of the logging.
Okay, CJ, you make a really great point, is that you can't turn all logging on because you're going to be overwhelmed with things that don't matter, and you will eventually run out of space. But there are things that are useful, especially when it comes down to like user behavior analytics.
Oh my God, this is brilliant too. Listen to this guy. Will you guys release the question and answer as a parsable log file?
You gonna grep it? Wait, yeah, I think we should.
That is brilliant. Thank you.
That's been asked before.
Anyway,
we're trying to figure out how to do that and maintain privacy.
We went through a project about a year ago in our environment to try and figure out how to log everything properly. This is the first thing we did, and then immediately realized that this does not catch Bloodhound. It does not catch Marcella's atomizer tool, and there's a whole lot of other things it doesn't catch, right? This isn't enough. This isn't even close to enough. So then we go here. This was also required. Did not solve the problem though.
It didn't.
Again,
So,
we go like, I can't really explain why this overrides that previous, like there's a default setting that this overrides that allows that previous GPO to then flow, but that wasn't a GPO, sorry. That previous PowerShell chunk to flow properly to the endpoints.
it needs to be LSDLU, I imagine.
Yeah.
All right, so these are more group policies about more logging.
So credential validation, this is what Atomizer was doing. We couldn't catch Atomizer events until we enabled these things.
So what is Atomizer?
Atomizer is a password spray tool. It's got one of my favorite logos in industry. Lady going.
Are you spray painting? Go spray painting.
Yeah, check out GitHub Atomizer. It's got a brilliant logo.
Okay, so we're turning logging on here for success.
Yeah, we're doing some more, exactly.
In theory,
Kerberos related.
Yes, we're catching some password sprays, but not all password sprays.
We catch previous tool password sprays with our configuration that we've already
But
accomplished.
not next gen password sprays.
Next gen.
Next gen. It's the
No buzzwords.
password spray -NNG. All right. Even more. PowerShell. Command
This one's very cool. You want to catch these things. You want to see these things, and you want to have alerts, filters, rules, and things that parse your ingests for stuff like this.
So what's interesting is here we're talking about if users are going to use PowerShell, we want to know about it.
Mm-hmm.
There's another group policy in our stack earlier on that said, do users need to be using PowerShell? And that's a great question too.
Very, very few.
But a lot of stuff also hinges on PowerShell. So if you were to outright deny it, you could also break things. That said, this is going to give you visibility into what's happening in PowerShell in your environment. With script execution and module logging, even more logging. Is it enough?
Yeah, I took your 4. You had all 4 of those screenshots
Yeah, this
on one slide. I couldn't. No, Forward one. Yep. You had
This one.
4 on here and I kind of
Didn't see it.
copied. So all of
Alright.
these things are related to the same PowerShell command transcription configuration.
And
then we catch ourselves in transcription executing Bloodhound
so
Sharkhound.
one of those group policies that were on those previous screens was dealing with the logging of the transcripts, and you have the ability to put a location of where you want those transcripts to go. And here you're showing that someone using PowerShell put into memory Bloodhound, it looks like, and executed Bloodhound. And that's very interesting because without those group policies, by default, you would have not seen this happening.
No, it doesn't show up.
And again, the conversation about Bloodhound and restricting Bloodhound's ability to do things. Bloodhound hinges on Windows environments, the way things normally operate in Windows environments. So it's very difficult just to outright prevent it from happening. But that said, you can definitely do things like this that say, hey, someone's running Bloodhound and no one should ever be running Bloodhound, typically, except for a blue team, but you should already know that. A typical, the marketing, the social media marketing specialist senior should not be running Bloodhound. All right, so the next one, the big one, the really, really big one that we're pounding into every webcast lately, the Sysmon. Sysmon's big. It's monitoring your system just like it sounds, right? And this is from the Windows sysinternals, right?
Sysmon is a sysinternals utility, right? Where in the world is Mark Rasinovich right now? Killing it, wherever he is.
All right, so Sysmon is a really great piece. It's going to monitor a workstation. You can deploy it with group policy. And once it's deployed, it's going to monitor the system. It's going to look for certain things like PowerShell execution. It's going to look for things in memory and everything that's happening. And you're going to be able to catch things. Now, in this case, you can see that it actually captured PowerShell executing Bloodhound again. Do you have another slide on this, Jordan? I can't remember.
I can't remember either.
Let's just go forward. Okay.
Nope, negative. We're almost there.
We're
man.
almost out.
I can't believe you got through this thing.
Well, it's because we don't have another 16 GPOs to talk about in this webcast. All right,
That's
so
because you're talking so darn fast.
tell me to slow down, CJ. We'll slow down.
Yeah, we can always.
We
slow
got
down.
time to slow down now. All right, so Sysmon. The idea here is that you've got a system that's an application that's going to monitor the behavior of the system. The thing it's going to look at memory. It's going to know if mimikatz is being executed. It's going to know if password hashes are being pulled off a system. And it's going to put those into an event log. And ideally, your event logs, again, are going to a centralized repository where you can alert off of them. So if in your environment, you have the ability within 5 minutes to know if someone is running mimikatz, that's a big deal because no one should ever be running mimikatz. And mimikatz, if you don't know, is going to give you password hashes from a local system, or also can pull plain text passwords out of memory, that type of thing. So group policy can do this. We've got another project with BHIS coming out that kind of packages Sysmon in a really great way that makes it easy to deploy and easy to configure. And that's going to be coming up here shortly. Jason, do you have any details on that, or CJ?
No, not at this time.
Okay.
But I do have a question.
It's in progress. Yeah, I got a couple too. Go ahead, Jason.
I think it's probably the same question. If Sysmon is enabled, do you need all the other stuff?
We learned after I kind of tried to answer this, but we spent a year or so with interns and just trying to get domains, quickly deployable, users created, scripts built, and testing. And we run 40 hours a week anyway. So these research projects are generally in addition to. We can hand our interns tasks. They learn things, they share things with us, we test things. It's kind of an iterative process of constantly learning about Windows alerting, logging, elk, Sysmon, and catching. And so we had spent a month or so probably messing with Windows logging, and then installed Sysmon and got everything we wanted. So we had got to the point where we were starting to understand Windows logging, Windows event forwarding, getting things around, ingesting that. And then just realize that Sysmon is ready to go, pretty much. So that's why we were hitting it really hard, because it will save you so much effort.
What we didn't talk about here is there's a really great ingester for Sysmon logs, which is Security Onion can do a really great job because people have already gone through and made logging triggers inside of Security Onion that use Sysmon. And the idea there is when you can start pulling very interesting things about user behavior analytics inside of Security Onion that can correlate across everything else that system is doing. And of course, Security Onion being open source. So, any other questions, Jason and CJ?
There are a ton, sir.
Oh, good.
Are there any restrictions to running Sysmon on more legacy environments like Win 7 Workstation
No,
2000.
it seems to work fine. We can't push you back further than Windows 7 or Server 2008 R2, and it works on those in the same ways we want them to.
And again, Windows 7 end of life.
Not far off, and
Yeah,
same with 2008 R2.
That's the next big thing you'd have to be checking out there, because even if you have these running, Windows 7, as soon as it hits end of life, there's not going to be security updates for it. So that's the thing to consider there.
Also
Yeah.
a note, on our YouTube channel, we have an entire webcast on Sysmon and other things like that. So if you are listening, feel free to go to our YouTube channel, and there are videos there that would dive into more details.
Again, there was a lot of content in this webcast, so we will try to duplicate this in multiple ways for it to be easily accessible, as well as certainly for those next set of GPOs we'd like to discuss. It'll be on the next webcast, because we could talk all day on this.
Yeah, right.
CJ.
Event log has, this is from Andy, event log has some tamper protection. This Sysmon config, can you do the same thing with Sysmon?
So we didn't talk about what to do with event logs, right? We said make event logs. Sysmon generates logs in the event log stack. Whether or not they're there becomes irrelevant if you're properly forwarding them onto somewhere else.
That's right.
So
yeah,
I
get them off the
mentioned,
system. Yep.
Yeah, so if you have an attacker that comes in and the last thing they do is clear event logs, it shouldn't matter, because by the time they cleared event logs, all those logs should have already been forwarded onto a centralized system. Now you can use open source ones, there's Helk, there's a security item we kind of talked about because it does a lot of IDS, IDR stuff. But ultimately, you want those to go somewhere else. You can simply just use event forwarding and push them to the DC as well. Obviously, that ends up being a lot of logs. You might want a dedicated system that does nothing but generate or capture those logs and store them in the forwarding event logs. But even then, it's good to have them, and it makes it so that if an attacker does go through and clear event logs, it doesn't matter. I think one of our interns actually made a script that pulled all the event logs and then cleared them afterwards, right?
Yeah, PowerShell, really, really cool tool called Log Grabber. So basically run from your administrative position on your network, whether it's administrative user on a workstation, a server, whatever, and it basically reaches out, enumerates all the workstations, and then grabs all the important logs, pulls them back, stores them. But Windows Event Forwarding, right? This also, I don't know if you discussed that, but Windows Event Forwarding will also solve this problem by pushing logs off into wherever infinity you want.
Yep. So, you don't have to have a gigabyte worth of log data on a workstation. You only need to have small logs, and as long as they're getting forwarded off, that's all that really matters there. Another question?
Lots.
Like the stars.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here, and it's pretty obvious there's a ton of Windows knowledge in here, and I would love to sit down with these people who are asking it super advanced questions and have them share with me.
Absolutely.
Hey,
go ahead, Jason.
Do you recommend separate admin users for servers versus workstations? Use Microsoft tiering?
Like my help desk isn't going to necessarily need administrative privilege on my server environment.
So to me, that's like the question.
Exchange.
Do you have separate DB admins? Of course you do.
Definitely.
Least privilege is always in effect.
And if you remember, we talked about the jugular earlier. So you can have permissions that are delegated so that only certain users can create accounts, and they're given that via an Active Directory group that's nested to the appropriate support group. Those things can be set up, right? You can delegate permissions, and also your DB, your database admins do not have to be domain admins. And then we also didn't talk about, like an entire bastion domain or a bastion forest or a red forest. Those are things that can be implemented that kind of allude to what you're talking about as well. As you're talking about separation of duty, we can get to the point of separation of domains, where your red forest is actually where your admins are, and they only log into that red forest when they need to make changes to the domain that's actually operational. So there's lots of things that can be done there. Kind of out of scope for this webcast, but there's a lot of options there, definitely.
So here's one. Why would you set the guest account status as not defined instead of disabled?
That was a screenshot.
Yeah, or why, from my perspective, would I spend the time when I remember one time when there was a guest session that allowed SMB access. It isn't a common path to escalation on our tests. That does not mean it's not for attackers. I have generally ignored it because it has been useless to me.
I would, regardless though, it's an extra 2 clicks. So
yeah, that's true.
I think probably in the screenshot it wasn't done because it wasn't.
Yeah, exactly.
we, like Jordan said, we typically don't see an escalation via the guest account, but just best practice would be to have it disabled anyway.
There was one I just missed, something about net sessions. Does anybody still see that? Surprised we didn't speak about net sessions, something.
Yeah, I saw that.
Moving too quickly. Net session enumeration blocking. Yes, we do generally recommend restricting administrative logins over the network. This is a great time to talk about your network perimeter. My favorite customer test I was ever on, they treated their workstations, every single workstation, as the perimeter of their network. They hardened those boxes extremely well. While I was able to gain credentials and hashes in the server environment, I was unable to use any of that to access their workstation environment. So generally, yes, there are rules in GPO that help with this, but we didn't have time. We didn't address it last night. Probably should have, indeed. So we did have one slide on network logons. Do you want to pause back there?
I'm fine. There's so many questions.
Yeah, I know. I meant slides, but.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
There is something that I've had a couple, just reading through some of the questions. Some people are saying that you got to be careful with these group policies because they can actually have unintended impacts. And yes, they can. One of them was with protected groups. And if you configure protected groups in a certain way, you can actually break things in SQL. And yeah, I mean, you have to look at these and you can't just go and deploy them. You need to be able to test them first. And we kind of take for granted that's already part of this cycle when you deploy group policies that you're testing it first. But so things like even SMB signing disabled, you legitimately might have an SB server out there that's sitting that is not authenticated on your environment, but is necessary on your environment. Things like a printer and or a multifunction device printer, right?
Yeah.
And those are things that as soon as you enable this, you have the potential to break that. And it really just means that we're not suggesting don't do it. We're suggesting you might have more work to go fix something else. Just like SMBv1, right, with Blue Eternal. You don't want those out there. We didn't even talk about it today because it really, we don't see Blue Eternal that much anymore.
No, not much, no.
For last year,
Most
we saw
people patch because you can't not patch in Windows unless you deploy a policy that says don't patch.
Don't patch, which would probably not be a great policy to run. Unless you have a really great policy cycle that says you are testing your updates before you deploy them. Does anybody still do that? Test every patch before it gets deployed? I haven't seen anyone do that in a long time.
No, and that's a crazy thought too, because it's required in every single compliance framework. I do not care if you can't afford it. You are testing your patches before you roll them out. You will have a documented process that we can audit. You will have a procedure you follow, and you will be able to prove it.
But Microsoft gives us 500 updates every other day. Yeah, they don't give that many, but you see the point there is it can be overwhelming to be able to test all those patches. And certainly even if you test them, you're probably not testing them across every workstation in your system with every different hardware deployment.
Yeah.
Oof. There are
We have
so
a tough
many
time
questions.
keeping up with
No
questions
doubt.
with this many people.
Hello for business. I haven't heard of that one. Yeah, we are looking at Kerberos being an improvement over NTLM v2 and probably going to start testing that stuff. I have not spent enough time to speak to Kerberos authentication on Windows domains. I know it is best practice.
Question here from Jan. What about signing PowerShell scripts? Is this common practices so hard in the
Yep, that one's
environment?
in here too somewhere.
I was looking forward to
Yeah.
we flew over it. So
We definitely
it was,
recommend enforcing signing. That does not mean that someone can't, in their session, PowerShell EP bypass.
there it is.
Thank
Left-hand
you.
side. So yes, the idea here is that by default, if you try to run PowerShell in Windows, it's going to say, hey, whoa, hold up. Your script does not appear to be signed. We're not going to let you run it. But if you run this cool command, it'll change it so you can run it. This is a group policy that says, no, you can't just run this other command to run it regardless. It actually has to be signed. But it can still be bypassed. But the point there is that it slows someone down.
For SIMs right now, we are still leaning on Elk, Helk, Software Elk, and Security Onion. Those tools are configurable. They do everything we want. They accept ingest from our small environments, right? We have small test environments, 30 workstation servers, whatever. I do not know how well a single Security Onion build will scale, but there are free tools to do this as well as any commercial product out there. They just need configuration, they need resources, they need hand-holding, they need the same things that all of us admins have to do on a daily basis, which is touch and love and care for.
Jason's about to cut your tongue, man.
I'm about to say any final words as we end the recording, and then we'll stick around for the post-show.
Yes, this is why we did not do all of the GPOs we wanted to do. We just wouldn't have had time to get through all of them.
Yeah, and thank you all so much for joining us. It's amazing. I have learned a ton.
Again, content will be posted. Will be probably emailed out, Jason, maybe? I don't know. Slides will be available on the Active Counters website.
Thanks for coming, Kevin. Appreciate you.
Also have a blog related to some of these GPOs out there. In fact, if you search BHS blog for GPOs, you're already going to find some of these in there anyways.
Rock NSM, anyone heard of that? I'm going to post that one real quick so I flag it.
Jason, CJ, you want to close us out?
Yep. Thank you all for joining us today. If you registered, which if you're here, you registered. If you're watching the recording right now, we'll make the link available to where the slides are. But everyone that is currently listening to this will get an email from us saying, here's the slides, here's the recording, and here is all the information that we could possibly take from the Q&A and put into a blog form. So thank you so much for being here today. Thanks for all the questions that you asked, and thank you for joining us for the Black Hills Webcast.
Thanks, Cameron.
All right.
Cheers.